thanks so much for everybody for coming, and especially I know we're last in the day, and we're standing between you and beer, but I'm kind of excited about this panel. Like, part of the reason I put this panel together is that as a marketer, I hear a lot of people, I read a lot of things about marketing, and people are talking about marketing and growth, and I have kind of a personal pet peeve about people saying there's one way to do it, there's a magic silver bullet, there's a thing you're going to do, and it's going to be perfect. And so what we have on this panel are three people that are awesome marketers, but they're all doing extremely different things because they're in extraordinarily different markets. The topic of this pitch was around launches, so I thought we would start with kind of a conversation around launch, which is one that I think launch as a term for marketers is a confusing one. So, everybody kind of has their own definition of launch. Like, some people think launch is the day that my thing goes live and that's it. Some people think launch is a phase thing or a set of activities. So I wanted to kind of start with you guys giving me some, how do you define launch? And then more importantly, how do you know if you've got a successful one? And I think I'll start with Katherine. See, she's right here.
So my name's Katherine. We launched officially our product just over a year ago. And in doing that, I found it fascinating over this last year to see just how many times you can actually launch something. So we had this initial launch where we put the concept out there. And then a few weeks later, we had our official beta launch where people could actually sign up and start using it on their own. And since then, we've been able to, whether it was new features or new aspects of the product, create new plans around launching those. And a lot of people think, oh, it's the TechCrunch article, that was your launch. That will give you a spike, but it's really what are you going to do to try to sustain that, keep up interest over a period of time, create an executable plan. And in startups, it's hard to plan too far out, but I think around launches, you really need to think of what is it beyond one writer writing a story. So that's a little bit about us.
Yeah, I think, look, from an engineering perspective, launch might be a moment in time. The code gets pushed. From a marketing perspective, maybe there was a time that it was a moment in time. You could have a press conference and a bunch of journalists would show up and write about your stuff. But unless
press
you're
conferences,
Apple,
you got to be old to remember press conferences. Like, you got to be ancient. Yeah, I remember those.
They still happen. It's just
they
called
do.
Apple, right?
Right.
And and so I look at it a little bit more as like a commencement address at university, right? You think it's about the end of college, but really it's about the start of the rest of your life. And from a marketing perspective, that's sort of how I view the launch as more of the starting point versus the end point, right? Engineering releases a product, and now it's your job to take that, get people aware of it, get the right people aware of it, and squeeze some money out of those people. And that happens post-launch.
Now, Ken is going to give us like the gaming perspective on this. And whenever Ken gets talking about doing launch of a game, I'm like terrified. I'm like, this is the most terrifying marketing motion ever. So with that, I don't know.
I think launches. It really depends on the context of what you're trying to achieve. So if you are a startup who's, say, you're looking for funding and you're looking for press, then having the biggest launch possible on day one is definitely something you want to aim for. But if you're just trying to build out a product and you're still exploring how that product will be used, you can do a phased launch. So when we launched our first game, Please Stay Calm, we went through multiple small phases of launch before we did the real launch. Launching in Canada first, and then seeing how the servers and the users hold up, and then you launch it in worldwide and or Canada and US app stores. And I did a relaunch after I got numbers from the initial launch. I used that as a interesting infographic post that I created to relaunch the game to talk about the numbers from the first launch. Sounds really weird, but people love seeing infographics. People love seeing real data, and it was an interesting way for us to get a secondary, boost in blog posts and coverage.
But how important is your initial launch in the App Store to be on the top list or on the the sort of crack into this game is hot thing?
It's really good to get visibility from having a really big launch on the App Store where you're featured. We were just featured recently with Pocket Mobsters. What I think that does is it doesn't guarantee long-term income or sustainability. What it guarantees is people at Apple know who you are. people in in the press know who you are, and that's really valuable. You definitely need to do your homework and make sure that while it's still hot, you connect with the people you want to connect with, because it's, they've seen the feature or they've seen your app appear on the lists. The reference point is still there. The context is fresh. So that's what the importance of that is. But in terms of like saying just because you were featured by Apple does not mean that your startup is now successful. That has no correlation. It just means now is a good time to start doing work and doing the legwork to connect with everybody you need to connect with while everybody knows who you are right now.
That actually kind of brings me to the second question, which is like, so I notice at Startup Festival, when I go around and talk to people, a lot of people that I talk to are in like a pre-launch phase. So there's a lot of really early, is anybody like pre-launch in the audience? Couple, yeah. So what's your advice, like, and Ken, you got the microphone, so maybe I'll start with you, but what's your advice, like pre-launch? What can you do from a marketing perspective to get ready for, okay, the thing's not available yet, but it's going to be available, what should you be working on?
I would start talking to people like the press to get them interested in what you're building. You can put a embargo on the information until launch day, but if they get early access to see something, especially if it's something that everybody can use, like if it's a broad consumer-based service, the reporters or the bloggers, they love having early access to stuff, that, especially if it's interesting. Obviously, I'm assuming you're all building really awesome, interesting things. So assuming that, they will be interested in seeing it early and kind of being on the inner circle. And you need to start that process way before you actually launch something, because it's all hard work. Unfortunately, I don't have there's no easy way about it.
The metaphor I use, just as I think about marketing, is it's really plumbing. It's not the sexiest metaphor, but it works for me, right? There's three main pieces. There's the pipes, there's the water, and there's the spigot. And you can start to sort of architect your marketing plumbing, if you will, way before you reach launch phase. So the pipes are like, what tools are you going to use? Are you going to use marketing automation? Are you going to use email? Are you going to use social monitoring? Are you going to use a webinar platform? All of that stuff. And you can spend time getting smart on those tools, figuring out which ones make sense for you. And also, like, the guy from Google talked earlier about being in perpetual interview state, like interviewing people who are expert in those tools, because there's a lot of specialist talent out there. And then the second component is water, right? It's what you push through those pipes, and that's the content. So that's, what white papers would you write, or blog posts, or ebooks would you publish, or infographics you mentioned. And so you can spend that time pre-launch doing sort of a catalog of everything your potential audience might be interested in consuming from you. And then the third piece is the one you can't really do fully until after launch, but it's the spigot. It's the touch point between your marketing and your potential customer. And because there's a lot of trial and error in that, do trade shows work? Does Facebook work? Are they on LinkedIn? Are they on Pinterest? You might be surprised in what you find out. We market to developers, and it turns out Facebook is our best acquisition channel. And you would think, like, intuitively, Facebook would be the worst. So, no matter how smart you are, a fact trumps opinion, and that's the fact. So for us, we're constantly evaluating that last touch point, the spigot of where our customers really live and where they kind of turn the faucet to acquire our content.
Yeah, and for those of you out here who are actually pre-launch, I'd say one of the best possible things you could be doing is, going up to press or writers or people and even just asking them for advice or telling them about your concept and building those relationships in a more organic way. Because, these people are being inundated with people giving pitches, and yes, you can definitely, create lists of hundreds of bloggers and reach out to those people and pitch them stories. But if you met someone at Startup Festival, or you met someone at the bar, or you are introduced by a friend, the likelihood of them actually covering your story is just so much higher. We also work with a ton of different companies that are sort of getting ready for Kickstarter, getting ready for platforms like that in a launch. And I'd say that unlike, a company that has maybe 2 years where they're going to figure out their marketing strategy, these companies, they either needs to work within about 5 days, or they've are just going to be unsuccessful. So we've figured out that there's sort of a formula that those companies have to use on Kickstarter in order to actually make it successful. A lot of it is, preceding email lists from friends and families to get the campaign going quickly. It's looking at a lot of the templates that other Kickstarter people have used to really craft their video and craft their actual messaging and story for that audience. And finding bloggers that are very interested in their space that will be highly likely to cover it within the first couple days. And if they can get themselves over a certain momentum point, they're probably going to be successful in that 30-day campaign. So depending on how you're launching or where you're launching, I'd say timing can be very important. I mean, look at Mailbox app, and
Right.
if that, they tried launching many different things, many different times. This one was a hit. This one worked. But it was the kind of thing that they needed such scale that they really had to, on day one, have those, levers that were going to make this an app that people shared and that, being able to see what number you were in line. A lot of companies have actually been able to use that as a launch tactic.
Yeah, that's cool. That actually gets me thinking about media coverage. So a lot of the companies I work with, they do their initial sort of media thing, like, okay, we're here, we're announcing, we're in the market, and then a month later they're like, you know what, press was awesome, that drove a lot of signups and stuff, but we don't have anything to talk about now. So, like, how do you get people to, so the initial news of, yeah, we're in market and we do this thing is gone. So now how do you make sure that, how do you get the attention of media, press, people, when the initial story is done?
Yeah, well, I'd say that, press, you shouldn't be entirely reliant on press as your marketing strategy. It will
Clearly.
cause a lot of problems. But if we're just focusing on press, I'd say that one thing we've really found is that you go through these sort of hype cycles. So you have your initial launch, and there's sort of that hype around that, and it's going to result in, if you can get a great writer to write about you, you'll probably get about 6 or 7 other articles that just sort of naturally flow out of that. And then you really need to almost go back to the drawing board and sort of, okay, what is the next angle, the next thing that we can talk about? Maybe it's numbers from our launch. Maybe it's, this is what we learned from our customers, and this is new stuff that we're going to be adding to it. Maybe it's an amazing customer story that you think will just speak to this particular audience.
Right.
Or it could even just be, we launched in tech. Now we're going to go launch in this segment of the market that doesn't know we exist yet, and really focus on that. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can play it, but you have to, really refactor and come out with something that's new and interesting. If it's already been talked about, it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to cover the exact same story that's now old news.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, it's one thing I found people make, like the biggest mistake people do is they assume everybody actually cares about their product. And I think what you need to do is to think at a higher level of why people should care about your product. And even when you're dealing with the press, you really need to give them a package of it's basically a pre-written story for them to just use. Because they're not going to look at your product deep enough, not like you know it, to find a story that works. So they're looking to you to make sure that you're giving them a story, 2 stories, 3 stories, or just something that they can use to excite their audience, because that's what they're trying to do. They're putting something together where they can put a post out and get tons of likes, get tons of retweets, and if you don't have a story other than the fact that you're new, that's not going to do it for them. So you really have to think, how is somebody outside going to look at what I'm doing, and how do I make that interesting to everybody, or at least your intended audience, and give the press that story already written, like totally decked out for
With
them
a bow
already.
on
So
it.
they don't have to do any investigative journalism just to find out what your product does and why it's important.
So that's kind of like, don't expect the journalist to do journalism. It's
You're
kinda
going to
how I
get
sum
killed
up.
for
Yeah,
that if there's a journalist in the room.
All right. Some journalists are right in this thing.
No, you're
Like
going to get killed for
Casinos,
saying it, not for...
Yeah.
No, it helps them. They like it.
Look,
Yeah,
there's a...
that's true.
what appears to be a PR problem is actually a math problem. Back in the first .com boom, it was about a 1-to-1 ratio between PR people and journalists. And it's 4-to-1 now, and possibly even worse. So there are just fewer... The audience to consume your story is shrinking as the audience of competitors telling competing stories is growing. So it becomes, it's just bad math, right? tip I would give is, and I can back it up with a real example. One tip I would give is like your content, like aim for paragraph 2. Let me answer it that way. Aim for the second paragraph. If you're gunning for, company X launches product Y, you're going to be dissatisfied. When I was at Eloqua, we're a big company, we're doing really well, getting ready for an IPO, spent 2 years developing the next generation of the product. We launched it and got maybe 10 or 15 stories. It was good. We would publish a great piece of content and get 200 stories. And those 200 stories, what we would get is this content was, paragraph 2 would be Eloqua, marketing automation company, published this research or this infographic. And so we wouldn't be in the lead. The lead would be what the content is, what the research was. And then the second paragraph is where they talk about the author or the creator. And that's where you get your brand in the article. And that is infinitely more successful at the in-between time.
Yeah.
Between those hype cycles, right? Anybody can get coverage if Andreessen invests in your startup, right? A monkey can get that PR coverage. The magic happens in what do you do in between those hype moments.
Yeah. Tell me, I want Joe to tell a story about like that Salesforce announcement newsjacking thing you did because it's cool. Because I think it's a good example of, I think one good way is to get people, like journalists have a job just like everybody else, right? And so their job is there's something happening out in the world and their boss says, go write us a story about that. And part of what they have to do is kind of scramble around and figure out what the story is. And so I like your example of the Salesforce announcement and you guys at Kinvey sort of like snuck in there on that one.
So that was fun. Like Salesforce, they looked like they might be friends, and then they started to look like frenemies, right? And they made an announcement, and it sounded a heck of a lot like they were going to compete against us. They didn't come right out and say we entered the backend as a service category, which is like the buzzword we use, but they described it pretty similarly. So we could do 3 things. We could like cower in the corner, or we could write a blog post that says, no, they're not really competing against us, and try to quell people's fears. Or we could take it head on, and that's what we did. And so we had this infographic that was the back-end as a service ecosystem map. So it looked like a giant subway map of our category and all the adjacent categories, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, all of that. And there were stops along the map, and those stops were different companies. And the back-end as a service space had like 31 competitors in it. And so what we did is, that day they made the announcement. We got a leak from a journalist the day before, so we did it all the night before. We updated the map, put a little tiny dot on it for Salesforce, and wrote a blog post that said, Kinvey welcomes vendor number 32 to backend as a service, Salesforce. And so it was a little snarky, and then we wrote the post. And then we had to hustle the hell out of it, right? Because all the journalists got this story under embargo from Salesforce. So that morning, their stories all ran before we had a chance to jack their news. So then we had to hustle it on Twitter, and every time somebody was talking about it, we would share that infographic and share our blog post. And then a guy from TechCrunch, their enterprise journalist, caught wind of it. And he's like, wow, this is a really good angle. I didn't realize the space was that crowded. And his story is like, Startup Kinvey challenges Salesforce. So we kind of turned the whole thing around for ourselves. And that was just through a little creativity and hustle.
Yeah.
Sort of on that angle, I was actually telling April, we recently had a sort of similar experience. We were launching this new blog series where we do these in-depth interviews with founders of hardware companies, and I had gotten one of my friends to do the first interview with us, and we knew that they were going to be doing a very major funding announcement coming up. So we decided that we would launch our in-depth, awesome interview with him on the same morning that they were embargoing all of their major funding news. And it turned out that even though ours was not about their funding, we ended up being the top Hacker News link for their funding. We ended up being the most shared link for their funding. The company shared us about their funding just because we added this sort of like, oh, and they announced funding today, to the whole backstory on their company. And we ended up getting thousands and thousands and thousands of people sharing this story just because we made it timely, and it sort of kickstarted the next few weeks of interviews that we'd be coming out with.
Yeah. And Ken, you got a story about the flat graphics thing, which I thought was cool, but I don't know if that's a story you'd like to tell. But We were having a conversation the other day about Apple made the announcement about new version of the OS, and everybody's trying to write a story about flat graphics, and then you guys came out with that app.
Oh yeah, so there was a side project thing that I just decided to put out with me and my brother, and it was basically after iOS 7 beta kind of came out, and we decided this was an interesting opportunity to put something out there that aligned ourselves very well with what Apple was trying to push forward with, which is, I guess, this whole hype about flat design. And so me and my brother put together an app called Scientific 7-Minute Workout, which was based on that New York Times article that went floating around. It was a weekend project. I did the whole design, purposely did it all, following the flat design principles and so forth. And it took like zero work to get Apple to feature it when it launched. So they put a front banner on the health and fitness apps because the design was totally in line with what they were trying to push for their future iOS 7 launch. So it's a good starting point to. A lot of people ask me what it takes to get featured by Apple, and it's not any one thing, but it certainly doesn't hurt to basically become their front line in marketing for their devices and their agenda. So whatever Apple is trying to promote, if your app follows in line with that, if it uses the technology that they're introducing, new stuff, like when the gyroscope first came out, if you had something that used the gyroscope and you use iCloud and you use the iAd platform or whatever else they're trying to push, and you are fully in line with them, it certainly smooths out the conversation with them when you're talking to them about your new app. That's the easiest path to getting featured, is to make their stuff look good and follow their marketing.
Yeah.
Total semi-tangent here. I think there's a little bit of a theme about this notion of ego trapping people, right? Or you could ego trap a company, right? Apple in that case.
That's right.
One thing I did as just a personal side project was I read this article in Huffington Post that said 100 million sharks are slaughtered every year, mostly for shark fin soup. And I was like, 100 million? I couldn't get out of my head. And I thought that number is too big for most people to like process the enormity of it. So I worked with a friend that's a designer, and we did an infographic that looked at visually what 100 million sharks looks like. And it was really a wow visual. And I went back to the Huffington Post writer and said, like, I was blown away by your article. Here's a graphic we created based on it. I have no skin in the game. I just thought, I was inspired by your work. And so she covered it. Then Wired picks it up. Not Wired, Fast Company Design picks it up. Another Fast Company offshoot picks it up. I can't even count the number of publications. I mean, it was like more viral than anything I did when I was getting paid to do this stuff. And it all started with, ego trap's probably a strong word, but going back to the source and saying, like, you were the inspiration for this, thank you for it, and then that started the PR ball rolling.
That's cool. We've talked a lot about media relations and PR. Like, thinking about customer acquisition, like, what's your best kind of guerrilla customer acquisition tactic? Like, I'm thinking about, I get in the 10 minutes. No, we started late. All right. So, all right. Okay, no, I got it. That's good. So, what's your best, like, customer acquisition tactic? Like, and ones that take a lot of dollars don't count. Who wants to do that? Maybe you do that.
I'll be real quick. I think don't get too swayed by the $300 million button. I don't know if you saw the keynote this morning. I think that's troubling. I think it would lead most people to try to find that silver bullet, and generally that silver bullet doesn't exist, right? That was a Google example. I think it's at the margins, right? It's using Optimizely and optimizing button color and text on buttons and button placement and landing pages and pre-populating forms and like A/B testing the hell out of everything, gaining 2%, 3%, 5%, 10% everywhere you can, and that's going to continue to pay off dividends in the long run. One hacky thing we did was when somebody comes to a Kinvey landing page, converts on a piece of content, we used to serve them a thank you page and say, click here to download your content. We don't do that anymore. We want people to open up an account with Kinvey and try the platform. And so what we do now is we serve them a thank you page that says, we've just emailed you the asset that you requested. Click here to open your Kinvey account. And then that pre-populates the sign-up form using their cookie. And it's every day we get 300% more account signups than we did before we started changing that form. That was one meaningful growth hack we did.
Yeah.
Taking the friction out of the sign-up process.
Right.
I'm not sure if there's any one particular guerrilla tactic. I think Joe's right. You have to kind of do a bunch of everything. I can give you one example where A/B testing is really important, and that's and again, I'm going to talk about the app world because that's where I live. Is the app icon is one of your first, I guess, the frontline soldier in the war to get visibility on the App Store. And it's so easy to do an A/B test on an app icon. You just do a Facebook ad, put the 2-3 different icon designs up there with the same copy, and just do like a $100 test, see which one gets more click-throughs. And it's amazing that what you think is never what turns out. Either it doesn't matter, or there's a clear winner, and that's what you want to see. You want to see the clear winner because that just basically makes your decision for you. Because it's hard to subjectively decide on what a design is optimal. Because what you think is optimal is not necessarily what your audience is going to find optimal. And that's like such a simple test. You can do that for any app that you do. Just come up with 3 designs and put them out there, and you'll be pleasantly surprised at the clarity that you find from doing a simple test like that.
Yeah, our experience has been very similar in that there's not been sort of one magic bullet that has sort of led to everything. It's been just doing a lot of different things, and we've become very interested recently in trying to automate as much of our marketing process, and automate as in at least just not have it take up the core team's time. So we've actually hired a bunch of virtual assistants in the last couple of months through a service called Odesk. And they'll do a lot of our initial, we want to do a launch and we want to target these 5 types of media, go out there and research writers in all 5 of these industries, create a list, what do they write about, how would we contact them, and just things that would have just taken up a lot of my time. They're necessary, but we can get someone to do that at a very, very low rate and get it back extremely quickly. We've found Mechanical Turk has been incredibly helpful for us if we have a list of either our customers or other people that we want to learn more information about. We want to find out how to contact them, or we want to know what e-commerce solution are they currently using. And Mechanical Turk is basically crowdsourced data entry. So you can put up a list of, this is 100,000 websites, and people from Mechanical Turk will answer the 5 questions you want answered for 20 cents an entry. And you can just get a whole lot of people working on something. For us in terms of the PR media side, we have sort of changed our strategy many different times. Initially, we were very much for the embargoed release, and we would put so much time into planning these embargoes and managing all the media that were under embargo. And then it would be great. We'd get 10 or 15 articles, and it was really exciting. But then we'd realize that only 2 of them actually drove traffic and signups. And from there, we would try to do non-embargoed, but at this point we realized that, we're just going to go to those writers that we know drive quality signups and quality traffic, and we're just going to give them an exclusive on the story. They like us because now they feel like they're building a relationship with us. If they're a good enough writer at a good enough publication, they're probably going to be about 6 people that copy their story as soon as it goes out, and it's so much less time-consuming for me to manage that launch. So those are some of the things that we've been doing.
That's cool. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go. So last thing, and I have to ask this because it was on the description of the session. But looking back at everything you know about marketing today, and if you sort of roll back to when you were just starting out and you didn't know anything, what's the one piece of advice you wish somebody gave you about growth and user acquisition and getting people to love your stuff? Anybody who wants to go first? Awesome piece of advice to finish up with.
That science is beating art, right? And it hurts me to say that, but it's becoming science. And I think that Dave McClure was he was bombastic by design, and I agree with his point, but he made it sound like the type of marketing he encourages people to do is an edge case. And I think it's more of the norm than he leads us to believe, or that he himself believes. Science is beating art when it comes to marketing, and the advice I wish I had earlier was like, I don't know, get some technical chops, because you know, like this whole growth hackiness requires, if not coding ability, at least the ability to talk on the level with engineering, and you know, and that's a skill I wish I had more of.
For us, I'd say I wish someone had really focused us earlier on sustainable growth tactics. You know, we were great at PR initially. We were great at sort of getting that initial attention and word out. But it's a lot harder for us to then look forward to the year and project and be like, this is how we're going to grow, because so much of it had been this sort of organic growth and PR and all these things that it was hard for us to really wrap our minds around, okay, how is that going to happen over the next year? And now in the past, 6-8 months, we've been really focusing on, what are things that we know we can replicate, we can control our own growth. And we've been putting a lot more time and effort into being able to control that ourselves. And I wish we'd sort of really start thinking about that earlier on.
I think the only thing I would say that I learned through this process is that nobody cares about your stuff as much as you do. So you definitely need to frame a story around what you're trying to do. And it's not a list of features, because that's just, being new is not interesting. If you're solving a particular problem that's never solved before, then that is interesting, but you have to still wrap a story around that so that it doesn't come off just like, we're doing this one thing that's going to help certain people do this. Put a character in there, put yourself in there, put the journalist in the story if it makes sense, and you're creating a much easier path for somebody to really understand why you care about what you're doing, because you have to make them care.
Yeah, awesome. We've got like 2 minutes. Anybody got a question? Then don't be shy. Come on. It's the end of the day, but there must be someone with a question. Someone with a question?
We covered everything.
You guys know everything? You're all good? You're totally tooled up? Everybody just wants to drink beer? All right. There we go. Brave guy.
With the escape philosophy as a theme, but at the same time, I guess storytelling is a more long tail. I mean, I'm big on the storytelling element, but I get pressure from my co-founders. You have to drive it down a little bit. Perhaps, I think you addressed it a little bit about the balancing act between the story and...
Yeah, the question is, how do you sort of balance between, an immediate need to move some metrics, right, versus a thing where you're sort of building up, a bigger story, a longer thing.
I almost think that, the escape velocity launch is the big story. I'd say that the longer tail version of that is less about story. It's more about science and mechanics and going from there. But, launching is about telling an incredible story. Like, no one gives a shit about, like, oh, look, we now exist. Like, you need to craft that. And you can even, look at certain industries and think, which companies do I actually care about in this industry, and why do I think of that company's name over all the other people? Why do I have an emotional connection with MailChimp over all of these other people in that space? And really think about that. And that's what you want to be able to create for yourself. So I think the story, it is really the most important part about the launch.
It's also not zero sum, and that being like science and art. So we launched our enterprise edition of our product. It was essentially a pivot, and we didn't know right off the bat on day one who our ideal buyer was going to be, right? But this was brand new to us, and so this was truly a launch pain, right? We didn't know if it was going to be the CMO, that is the person who orders an app to be built, or the CIO, that is the person who takes the order for an app to be built. And so we created an ebook that was, who is going to win the war for mobile, the CIO or the CMO? And we published that to see what title it got more traction with, because maybe that would start to inform who our audience would be. And so that was a way to sort of do almost like both content marketing from a name acquisition channel standpoint, but also like backdoor research to look at what titles are starting to engage with us more. But that's storytelling, right? Who's going to win the war for mobile out of these two factions? Turns out it was the CTO. Different entirely.
Good answer. Oh, there's another question here.
What about budget? Marketing budget for just for launching? How much? I mean, I know it depends which company, but etc. But what order of magnitude are we talking about?
Budget. So how do you set budget? What sort of budget? I love this question. I love this question because this is one of these questions as the head of marketing at a startup. You're always having this conversation about budget. Like, so take that one. One of you guys. I know Joe's
Yes, you
gonna
can do it
have
at,
to
you can do any of this at virtually any budget. You just can't do it at the same scale, right? Maybe you do more of the writing yourself. Maybe you go to a university and find a design student to design your graphics or to design your templates, or maybe you go to a premium firm like Just3, right? There's an option for every budget. What's important is to have the framework for what a great launch looks like going in, and then figure out where you can cut costs. Like you could do a launch for a few $1,000s. You could do a launch for an unlimited budget.
That's a great answer.
You could also do a launch free. And I know most startups, their first launch was probably done on absolutely zero budget and a lot of favors.
Sweat equity and favors. Bartering.
It gets
here.
harder to ask for all those favors as you sort of go down the line. But I mean, our initial launch, I mean, it was on a nothing budget. But I think that, that changes as your team grows, as, the different aspects of what you want to do. Are you creating, new content? Is there videos involved? Is there a new website that's involved in this launch? Are there, do you not have the skills on your team to do proper public relations and proper media outreach? Do you need to reach out to someone else? So yeah, for I think a lot of startups, it will be, how do I do this with nothing? But there are definitely options as you get more resources.
Yeah.
I think you guys covered it.
We've covered it. Oh, we actually officially just got the hook.
The stage is exploding in 5 seconds.
So thanks everybody for sticking around for the last session.